Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at. This is Dr. Sanchez, and we are going to be talking about the trait approach, which is chapter 2 of your book. The overview is the great person theory and the historical shifts in the trait perspective, and what traits differentiate leaders from non-leaders, and how does the trait approach work. This is very interesting. This was the beginning of most of the studies that was done on leadership. And so the trait approach basically was one of the first systematic attempts to study leadership, and it was the great man theory was really developed in the early 1900s. And it focuses on identifying innate qualities and characteristics possessed by great social, political, and military leaders. So this is basically saying that great leaders are born with these traits that make them excellent leaders. It's believed that people were born with them, and that makes them the great leaders. Examples of those great leaders in the great man theory is Abraham Lincoln, a woman, Joan of Arc, Napoleon, and these theories really started, or this theory really started in the beginning. So the question is, are leaders born with great traits, or can you learn them? And this great man theory differentiates it by saying, no, you have to be born with these great traits. So here's the historical perspective of the trait theorist. So in the early 1900s, research focused on the individual characteristics that differentiated great leaders from non-leaders, and that was the great man theory, and it talks about innate qualities, people that are born with leadership. And then in the 1930s and 50s, as I've talked about theories, there's a ton of theories about leadership, and this was Stojdil. He studied and analyzed 124 traits that could possibly be tied to leadership, and as a relationship between people and social situations. A man was also a theorist in 1959 and reviewed 1,400 findings of personality and leadership in small groups. So it was less emphasis on situations and more emphasis on personality traits that could be used to discriminate leaders from non-leaders. And Stojdil really focused on situations. In the 70s to 90s, Stojdil in 1974 analyzed 163 new studies and validated the original studies that there were 10 characteristics that identified with leadership. And they were drive for responsibility and task completion, vigor and persistence in pursuit of goals. Number 3, risk-taking and originality in problem solving. 4, drive to exercise initiative in social situations. 5, self-confidence and sense of personal identity. 6, willingness to accept consequences of a decision and action. 7, readiness to absorb interpersonal stress. 8, willingness to tolerate frustration and delay. 9, ability to influence others, people's behaviors. And 10, the capacity to structure social interaction systems to the purpose at hand. And so he found, Stojdil found, that these were the top 10 traits that were positively associated with leadership. The other study in 1986 was a meta-analysis. Personality traits can be used to differentiate leaders and non-leaders. And that was Lord, Divater, and Alliger. And then another theorist, which I particularly love, is Kirkpatrick and Locke in 1991. And he came up with the right stuff for leaders. And it's 6 traits that make up leaders. And again, in the 70s and 90s, all the theorists kind of focused on personality and behaviors. So Kirkpatrick came up with 6 traits that identified leaders. And it was 1, drive, 2, motivation, 3, integrity, 4, confidence, 5, cognitive ability, and 6, task knowledge. So as you can see through the studies, theorists are narrowing down what it takes to be a great leader. And now, in the 21st century, the studies are now focused on 5 major leadership traits, which is intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. And from these studies, we focus really on 5 leadership traits. So, intelligence is the ability to positively focus on things that are very difficult. So this is your IQ, basically. How smart are you? And theorists said you couldn't be a leader unless you were smart. You had to have a high intelligence to be a leader. Individuals like Steve Jobs, really smart. People like Bill Gates are considered very smart. So you couldn't be a leader unless you had a high IQ. Self-confidence was another trait you had to have, which was the ability to be certain about your competencies and skills. So you had a high sense of self-esteem and self-assurance. Again, the book talks about Steve Jobs, very confident. There's a borderline between confidence, right, and arrogance. And so it's those individuals who believe that they're very good at what they do and they have a high sense of self-confidence. The third trait that in today's society is believed to have great leadership skills is determination. And they have a high drive and dominance to drive, that are proactive. And your book gives you an example of Dr. Paul Farmer. And he showed determination in his efforts to secure health care and eradicate tuberculosis for the very poor of Haiti and other third world countries. His drive, his determination really set him apart from most physicians because he found ways to eradicate tuberculosis in various countries. So it's that high determination. and drive. Integrity is your fourth trait of leadership, and it's basically being honest and trustworthy, and that people who have a strong set of principles and take responsibility for their actions have high integrity. And so there could be a lot of leaders that you think about with high integrity. This could be Mother Teresa, comes to mind for me as high integrity. And then the last one is sociability. It's the leader's inclination to seek out pleasant social relationships. Leaders who are outgoing, courteous, tactful, and diplomatic. And they have good interpersonal skills and create cooperative relationships with their followers. And so your book talks about Michael Hughes, a university president who would rather walk out of all of his meetings and walk on campus and greet all the students and staff and faculty. Bill Clinton comes to mind as one political leader who was very sociable, had high sociability. They talked about how he was incredibly personable. Ronald Reagan, high sociability. So when you think about leaders, these are the 5 traits that we're studying now: intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. This slide goes over the intelligence, the self-confidence, and determination, which I just discussed. Again, traits to possess or cultivate if one seeks to be perceived by others as a major leader. Integrity, that's your character, and sociability. So studies have focused on if you can learn these and people perceive you to have these, then you can be a great leader. From all of that, we studied the 5-factor personality model of leadership. So over the past 25 years, a consensus has emerged among researching that the basic factors that we call that make up our personality are these 5, and we call them the big 5. Neuroticism, the tendency to be depressed, anxious, insecure, vulnerable, and hostile. Extroversion, the tendency to be social, assertive, and to have positive energy. Openness, the tendency to be informed, creative, insightful, and curious. Agreeableness, the tendency to be accepting, conforming, trusting, and nurturing. And conscientiousness, the tendency to be thorough, organized, controlled, dependable, and decisive. So your book talks about all of these, but this became a personality test. And it was started or began by looking at a meta-analysis of 78 leadership and personality studies. And in general, studies found that there was a strong relationship between the big 5 traits and leadership. It appeared to have certain personality traits associated with being a great leader. Judge found another study, the Big Five in Leadership study, used a meta-analysis, which resulted in a strong relationship between personality traits and leadership. So he basically studied out of the Big Five which ones were most associated with leadership. And he found extroversion the most strongly associated with leadership. So if you had you were an extrovert, this could be the most important trait to be an effective leader. The next one was conscientiousness, second most related factor with leadership, and the highest correlation with overall job performance. And then openness was the next most related. And the weakly related is agreeableness. So part of your book is that it talks about the last couple of pages will talk about strengths and weaknesses of the trait. But this was the strength, the strengths studies. Most of you have either done your strength finders or strengths 2.0. We started doing studies about how do strengths associate with leadership. And so strengths are the ability to consistently demonstrate exceptional work. So in 2001, Buckingham and Clifton came up with strength finders. And Rath in 2007 did more work about the strengths that could be associated with leadership. So the idea behind strengths leadership is that everyone has talents in which they excel or thrive, and leaders are able to recognize and capitalize on not only their strengths but those of their followers. So this is a shift, really, that you don't have to have innate great man traits, right? That you find the strengths you have, and that could be considered part of your leadership. And if you find strengths in others, you'll be able to find their leadership research, or their leadership skills. So very different from where we've come under traits. Strengths come from having certain talents, right? And then further developing those talents by gaining additional knowledge, skills, and practice. Then leadership capability is enhanced when we are able to discover our fully utilized strengths and underutilized strengths and weaknesses. So this says, hey, you find your strengths and your weaknesses, and if you start developing them, that will help you to become a great leader. All right, now emotional intelligence. So the 21st century studies now have focused on emotional intelligence, and I particularly love emotional intelligence. So as we talked about the old theories of major leadership traits, we talked about IQ. You had to be very smart to be a leader. That was the hypothesis. This says emotional intelligence is what you need to be a leader. And you don't have to be smart, but if you can do these things, the ability to perceive and apply emotions to life's tasks, if you're able to reason and understand emotions, if you're able to express emotions, if you use emotions to facilitate thinking, if you can manage emotions within oneself and relationships, you could very well be a great leader. So the underlying premise is people who are more sensitive to their emotions and their impact on others will be more effective leaders. And if you do a lot of studying about emotional intelligence, it's fascinating work. These are the ways you can measure EQ, and I will just tell you that most companies who do EQ use the Goldman assessment. That seems to be the standard, which is EQ as a set of personal and social competencies. You're self-aware, your confidence, self-regulation, consciousness, and motivation. There are now some companies that are using Shackman and Allen, EQ as an awareness of three aspects of leadership: context, self, and others. I particularly like Goldman because it measures 5 things, which gives me a good sense of the leadership, especially in self-regulation. Self-regulation is, are you able to conduct yourself without blowing up, right? That you're able to shift with the different circumstances like change, and you're able to not show anger. That is a big trait, especially in our corporate environments. So, how does the trait approach work? And we will go over each of these. So when you focus on the trait approach, it focuses exclusively on the leader. What traits does the leader exhibit? Who has those traits? And then there's personality assessments, where organizations use personality assessments to find the right people. So the Big 5 is a personality assessment. The Myers-Briggs is a personality assessment. And the assumptions increase that if you have a certain personality, that you'll be organizationally effective. And it specifies the characteristics and traits for specific positions. And it basically states that a personality assessment will measure a fit for a particular position. Here's at the back of the book I talked about, for every approach, a leadership theory, they talk about strengths and criticisms. And I like that. So when it came to the trait theory, the theory found from the strengths that it was appealing. The perception that leaders are different in that they possess special traits. People need to view leaders as gifted by having these certain traits. And it was credible because it was a century worth of research. I mean, it was one of the most researched theory that we have done in leadership. And it highlights leadership components in the leadership process. It's a deeper level of understanding of how leaders and personality related to the leadership process. And it provided benchmarks for what to look for in a leader. The criticisms of it was that it fails to delimit a definitive list of leadership traits. So there's endless traits, right? The great man theory traits, the 10 leadership traits. There was hundreds of lists of traits that leaders could have. And that's a big criticism because there isn't a definitive list, right, of leadership traits that we can all look at and say, okay, if you have these traits, 5 traits, 10 traits, then you have awesome leadership skills. The other thing about the trait theory is it doesn't always take into account the situational effects, right? A leader in one situation may not be a leader in another situation. And that's critical in business for the 21st century because our fast-paced business is always changing. And so that is difficult to monitor. Does a leader do well in change? Or does this leader just like the status quo? That's a very difficult thing to discern. The list of the most important leadership traits is highly subjective. Much of the subjective experience and observations serve as the basis for identified leadership traits. So there was studies over the past year that really just focused right on a certain group of individuals, i.e. men, which could be subjective. Not a lot of studies were done around the women. So again, that can be a challenge to really find out if that could have changed leadership traits. So, and research fails to look at the traits in relationship to leadership outcomes. So if you have a high IQ, and that's one of your traits, what is the outcome from a leadership perspective for that IQ? So those are the kinds of things that the trait theory could not discern. And then there really wasn't anything around training and development because the trait theory says you had to be this certain person. You had to have these traits. But that goes to the question, can you teach leadership? Can you develop leadership? And I believe that you can. But again, I'm asking all of you, is that what you think? And so again, it's something that I want you to think about over the course of this class is really deciding whether you're born with leadership skills or can you teach them. So I hope you have enjoyed this webinar and thank you again for listening. I'm sorry, this is the last one. Application, it provides direction as to which traits are good to have if one aspires to be a leader. And through various tests and questionnaires, individuals can determine whether they have the select leadership traits and can pinpoint their strengths and weaknesses, and can be used by managers to assess where they stand within the organization. And what is needed to strengthen their positions. So in the 21st century, the leadership traits that we look for is intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and social ability. Again, thank you for listening to this webcast, and I hope you have learned a lot about the trait theory.